My parents introduced me as the quiet one who helps in the back. They said it right in front of the banker. Then he looked at the paperwork, looked back at me, and asked, "I'm sorry, who actually owns the business?" For a second, nobody said anything. Not me. Not my father. Not my mother. The whole office just went still in that horrible, bright way quiet rooms do when somebody accidentally tells the truth before the family has agreed how it's supposed to sound. My mother laughed first. She always did that when she got nervous in public. A quick, airy little laugh. Like everything awkward was just a misunderstanding if she smiled at it fast enough. "Oh," she said, waving one hand like the banker had simply confused the seating chart. "Emily just helps out. Her father built all this." I can still see the banker's face. He didn't look convinced. He looked careful. He was sitting across from us in a glass office just off the main floor of the branch. One of those newer banks that tries to make itself feel less like a bank and more like an upscale dentist's waiting room. Everything was pale wood and clean lines and too much natural light. My father had worn a sport coat for the meeting. My mother had on pearl earrings and the expression she saved for any conversation that involved status, money, or someone she wanted to impress. And me? I was holding the folder with every operating statement, payroll report, vendor contract, and tax summary from the last 3 years in my lap. Because I was the one who put them together. I was also the one whose name was on the LLC documents. That was the part they kept leaving out. The banker glanced down at the file in front of him again. Then he looked at me. Not my father. Me. And said, very politely, "Miss May Carter, since you're listed as managing member and majority owner, I'll need your authorization before we can continue." That was the moment my father stopped smiling. You know how some men can go from pleasant to cold without changing their voice? My father was excellent at that. His mouth stayed almost exactly the same. His tone, when he spoke, was still smooth. But something in his face tightened like a wire being pulled too far. "There must be some confusion," he said. "My daughter handles paperwork. I own the company." The banker didn't argue. That made it worse. He just turned the signature page around and slid it gently toward me. "I'll still need Ms. Emma Carter's signature here," he said. I wish I could tell you I enjoyed that moment. I should have. After everything. After years of building that company quietly while my father took the credit. After listening to my mother introduce me to suppliers as our daughter. She helps with admin. After hearing my younger brother tell people I was good with spreadsheets, like I was a smart little cousin they let near a laptop for fun, I should have felt some kind of victory. I didn't. What I felt first was something closer to dread. Because if you grow up in a family like mine, public truth does not feel satisfying right away. It feels dangerous. I looked at the paper, then at my father, then at my mother, who was already straightening in her chair, preparing herself for whatever version of the story would best preserve him. And I knew, before anybody said another word, that this meeting had just become bigger than the loan they thought they were here to discuss. This wasn't really about the expansion financing anymore. Not to them. Now it was about control. About ownership. About which version of the family story got to survive contact with paper. My father leaned back in his chair and gave a short laugh that had no humor in it. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I founded Carter Home Supply 22 years ago. Everyone in this town knows that." That part was true. He had founded it, back when it was just a cramped little building supply shop with bad lighting and one temperamental forklift and a handwritten ledger he treated like state secrets. He built the original business from almost nothing. That was real. I'm not one of those narrators who pretends the villain never did anything. He worked hard. He took risks. He grew it. And then, years later, he almost lost it. That part was real too. He just never tells that part first. The banker kept his face neutral. "I understand the history," he said. but according to the current ownership documents, Ms. Carter is listed as majority owner. Again. Silence. My mother gave me a look then. A tiny one. Most people would have missed it. Not anger. Not exactly. Warning. That was one of my mother's gifts. She could say a whole paragraph with her eyes if the room was public enough that words might be used against her later. Don't embarrass him. Don't correct this here. Don't make the banker part of our family problem. Smile. Fix it softly. I had obeyed that look for years. Maybe my whole life. I was the quiet one. That was not a random description. That was branding. The quiet one. The helpful one. The organized one. The one in the back. The one who doesn't need credit. The one who understands how much pressure the men are under. You hear those things long enough and you start to disappear inside them. That was what my family had trained me for. Not open obedience. Something more useful. Silent usefulness. The kind that keeps businesses running and family myths intact at the same time. I set the folder on the banker's desk and opened it to the page I wanted. Slowly. Carefully. Because my hands had started to shake, and I did not want my father seeing that as weakness. The banker watched me do it. My mother shifted in her seat. My brother, Daniel, who had spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting half texting under the table because he assumed none of this required his attention, finally looked up. I slid the operating agreement out and put my finger on the highlighted line. I think this is what he's referring to, I said. My voice sounded much steadier than I felt. That bothered my father more than if I had cried. I know it did. Because tears he could dismiss, calm was harder for him. The banker read the clause, nodded once, and said, "Yes. Thank you." Then, as if this were the most normal thing in the world, he looked at me again and asked, "Would you like me to walk through the revised terms with you first? With you? Not your parents. Not your father. Not the founder. Not the man who still introduced himself in town as owner even after he had signed away enough control to keep the IRS. 3 creditors. And one very angry supplier off his back. You." My father's jaw moved once. Just once. That was how I knew he was furious. My mother stepped in right away. "Emily doesn't deal with strategic decisions," she said. The banker blinked, then looked at the file again. And this is the part I still think about. He wasn't rude. He wasn't smug. He was just exact. "Well," he said. "Legally. She does." That was the line. That was the hook hidden inside the meeting. Not the introduction. Not even my parents trying to erase me in front of a banker. That was familiar. In its way. The real moment was hearing somebody outside the family say, in one clean sentence, what had been true on paper for almost 3 years. "Legally. She does." My brother sat up all the way then. "Wait," he said, looking between me and Dad. "What does that mean?" I didn't answer him. Not because I wanted to be dramatic. Because I suddenly understood 2 things at once. First, Daniel clearly did not know the full structure of the business. That was interesting. And second, my parents had come into that bank assuming the old story would still be enough. Dad as founder, Mom as loyal witness, me as background support, Daniel as future son in waiting. They had expected the room to follow the family narrative. Instead, the banker had followed the documents. And the documents were mine. I should probably explain how we got there. Not all of it yet, just enough. 3 years earlier, when Carter Home Supply was bleeding cash and my father was one bad quarter away from losing the warehouse, the lenders, and maybe the whole company, I stepped in with the only leverage left. My savings. My credit. My plan. My systems. My ability to turn the chaos he called instinct into something a bank would actually finance. That was when everything changed on paper. Not in public. Never in public. Publicly, I stayed the quiet one who helps in the back. Privately, I became the reason the doors stayed open. That was the part my parents never learned how to live with. Because once a daughter becomes necessary, people like my father do one of two things. They either become grateful, or they become determined to act like necessity was always temporary. You can probably guess which version I got. The banker pushed the signature page closer to me. My father said my name in the tone he used when I was 12 and had corrected him in front of guests. Emily. Just that. And every warning I had ever been raised with was packed inside it. Do not shame me. Do not forget your place. Do not make strangers watch this happen. Do not force me to deal with you in public. But the thing about paper is this: it doesn't care who gets embarrassed. I picked up the pen, and that was when I realized this meeting wasn't going to end with a lone discussion. It was going to end with my family finding out what happens when the quiet one finally stops staying in the back. I didn't sign right away. That mattered. Because in my family, the first few seconds after something ugly happened were always the most important. That was when my mother rushed in to soften it. That was when my father tried to take control of the tone. That was when everyone silently decided whether we were dealing with a real problem or just my reaction to one. I had lived inside that pattern my whole life. So, even with the pen in my hand, even with the banker looking at me like I was the only person in the room he actually needed, I knew the next few seconds were not really about the signature. They were about roles. And my parents were already trying to drag me back into mine. My mother leaned forward in her chair and gave me a smile I knew too well. Small. Tight. Public. The kind of smile that says, "Let's all stay graceful here," while quietly making sure I understood who was expected to protect whom. "Emily," she said. Soft enough that the banker would hear concern. Not pressure. "Maybe let your father explain." That was her thing. Delay the truth until Dad could phrase it in a way that still kept him in front. I set the pen down. Not dramatically, just carefully. Then I looked at the banker and said, "I'm happy to hear the terms. I just think there may be some confusion in the room about how we got here." That landed harder than if I'd raised my voice. Because calm was always more dangerous in my family than anger. Anger they could frame. Calm made people listen. My father gave a short laugh and leaned back like this was all getting slightly silly. "There's no confusion. Emily handles operations. I handle ownership." The banker looked at the file again. That silence was useful. Because he wasn't arguing emotionally. He was checking documents. My father hated that. Men like him can handle confrontation better than verification. "I understand your role in founding the company," the banker said. "But the current controlling interest appears to sit with Ms. Carter. Appears to sit." Even that careful wording made my father's face tighten. My younger brother, Daniel, finally put his phone down, completely. "What does controlling interest mean?" he asked. Nobody answered him right away. That was interesting. Because if Daniel had known the real structure of the business, he wouldn't have asked that. Which meant he had been given the same public version everyone else got. Dad, as owner. Me as support. Daniel as the son waiting in the wings for whatever was supposed to come next. That told me something important. My father had not just minimized me in public. He had built a version of the business that kept even his own son comfortable and uninformed. I shouldn't have been surprised. Still, I was. I looked down at the signature line again. My name, my authority, my right to approve or stop the deal. And somehow, my parents had still walked into that bank, expecting the old family story to outrank the legal one. That was the setup in my family. Facts were tolerated right up until they threatened hierarchy. Then suddenly facts became technical, or complicated, or not the point, my mother said. "This is really more of an internal family structure issue than a legal one." The banker blinked once, then said, very politely, "For the purposes of this meeting, it's legal." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because that was exactly the kind of sentence nobody in my family ever said out loud. Clean. Exact. Uninterested in emotional ranking. My mother looked like she had bitten into something sour. She hated outsiders who stayed factual. My father recovered first. He always did. Emily, he said, turning slightly toward me. The voice still smooth. We're here to discuss expansion financing. There's no reason to complicate this. There it was. Complicate. Another family word. Whenever something was simple but inconvenient to my father, it became complicated the second I refused to let him narrate it. The truth was not complicated. 3 years earlier, Carter Home Supply had been in trouble. Real trouble. Not the kind Dad later described as a rough patch. I mean payroll close. Lender pressure. Supplier calling daily trouble. They had overextended on inventory, lost 2 commercial accounts in 1 quarter, and then got hit with a tax mess Dad had been meaning to handle for months. Back then, the company should have scared Daniel. It didn't, because Daniel didn't know enough to be scared. He was still in his early 20s and working in the showroom a few afternoons a week, which meant he thought business problems were mostly about whether trucks came in on time and whether Dad seemed stressed. He still believed Dad when Dad said things were under control. I knew better because I was the one doing the numbers. That was how it always worked. Dad was the voice. I was the system. Dad spoke in big instincts. I cleaned up the mess those instincts left behind. Publicly. He was the founder. Privately. I was the reason the electricity stayed on long enough for him to keep calling himself one. I didn't start out wanting control of the company. That part matters. I wasn't sitting around secretly planning to take it over. I didn't even want the title at first. I wanted stability. I wanted vendors paid on time. I wanted payroll to stop feeling like a weekly emergency. I wanted 1 quarter that didn't depend on luck and Dad's confidence holding hands and hoping for the best. But then the bank looked at the books. Then the creditors did. Then the accountant stopped using vague phrases and started saying words like restructure, liability, collateral, and personal guarantee. That was when everything changed. My father needed capital, needed clean credit, needed someone the bank could trust not to improvise. That someone was not Daniel, and by then, it definitely wasn't him. It was me. My savings went in first. Then my name. Then, after weeks of negotiations, my ownership stake. Not as a gift. Not as family symbolism. As the price of keeping the company alive. That was the part my parents never learned how to live with. They could live with me doing the work. They liked that. They could live with me sacrificing time, sleep, and my own career track. They liked that too. They could even live with me quietly becoming essential, as long as nobody said essential out loud. What they could not live with was paper that reflected reality. Because once paper did that, the family story had to either change or start lying harder. They chose lying harder. I had seen it happen slowly. First with suppliers. My mother would introduce me as our Emily. She's amazing with admin. Admin. That word carried half the business on its back by then. Then with clients, Dad would say, Emily keeps us all organized. In the same tone people use for a helpful assistant. Not the person who had renegotiated 2 vendor contracts and rebuilt the cash flow forecast from scratch. Then, with town people, I became the daughter who stayed. The daughter who worked. The daughter who helped in the office. Never the owner. Never the reason the ownership had changed in the first place. That was the role they built for me. The quiet one. The one in the back. The one who could carry weight without requiring status. It sounds cruel when I say it that plainly. Maybe it is. But it was also efficient. That role kept my father comfortable. Kept my mother socially protected. And kept Daniel positioned as the son who still seemed naturally closer to the future of the company than I did. even though I was the one holding the actual structure together. That's why the bank meeting mattered so much. Not because of the loan. The loan was real. We were looking at expansion financing for a second warehouse unit and updated fleet terms. I had helped prepare every figure in that folder. But the real danger of that meeting was something else. Public contradiction. My parents introduced me as support. The banker met me as authority. That was not a small crack. That was an exposure. And once I saw Daniel's face when he realized the banker was talking to me, not Dad, I understood something I should probably have understood sooner. Daniel didn't know the real ownership structure because Dad had never wanted him to. That made the whole room more unstable. Because now it wasn't just parents minimizing a daughter in public. Now it was parents preserving a family mythology in front of the son they still imagined as the rightful heir to something he didn't legally control. My father said my name again. Emily. That tone. Half warning. Half performance. It meant, not here. Not like this. Do not humiliate me. Do not force me to explain myself in public. I had obeyed that tone since childhood. Not because I was weak. Because girls like me get trained early that peace is part of their job. I looked at the banker. Then at the signature page. Then at my father. And I realized the actual setup of that moment was brutally simple. If I signed quietly, I would still be useful but unseen. If I asked questions, the whole family lie would have to stand up in fluorescent light and try to explain itself. That was the real choice in front of me. Not whether to approve the financing. Whether I was willing to keep helping in the back. And deep down, I already knew the answer was changing. If you asked my parents when all this started, they'd probably say it started at the bank. That would be easier for them. It would also be a lie. By the time that banker looked past my father and asked for the real owner, the truth had already been sitting under our family for years. Quietly. Patiently. Like grit under a floorboard. You don't notice it all at once. You notice the shift in weight first. Then the sound. Then, one day, your foot goes through. That meeting was just the day the floor finally gave way. My father really had built Carter Home Supply from nothing. I want to be fair about that. Because people like him survive by acting like fairness only belongs to them. He started the company 22 years earlier with a rented building. A second-hand forklift. And the kind of blind confidence that only works when the economy cooperates and your wife is willing to live with constant risk. For a long time, it worked. He knew product. He knew sales. He knew how to make people feel like he was the only man in the county who understood lumber, margins, and contractor schedules at the same time. What he didn't know was when to stop pretending instinct was the same thing as management. That part took longer to catch up with him. Growing up, I was always the capable one. That sounds like a compliment. It wasn't. In my family, capable meant low maintenance. It meant useful. It meant nobody checked whether I was tired. Because tired people could still be useful if they stayed quiet enough. My younger brother Daniel got a different role. He was the future. That was never said directly. Not in those words. Families like mine don't usually say the ugliest things out loud until they think they've already won. But it was there in 100 little ways. Dad brought him onto the shop floor when he was 12. Taught him how to talk to contractors. Let him stand near the register and absorb the mythology of the place. My mother would smile and say, "One day this will all be his headache." Everybody would laugh. I laughed too. Sometimes. That was the kind of mistake I made when I was younger. I treated things like jokes when really they were training. Because while Daniel was being introduced to the front of the business, I was being assigned to the back of it. Not literally at first. Just gradually. I was the one Dad trusted with inventory counts because I was meticulous. The one Mom asked to organize invoices because I was good with details. The one who stayed late in high school to fix payroll data entry mistakes because you understand the computer stuff better than your father. That phrase came up all the time. You're just better at this part. It sounds harmless until you realize no one ever follows it with, So maybe you should have the authority that goes with it. No, they just keep the competence and leave the credit where it already was. Dad in front. Me in back. Daniel nearby, absorbing the glow of being the sun. That structure hardened over time. By the time I was 26, I was doing half the things nobody in the company could afford to screw up. Vendor reconciliation, payroll review, tax prep packets for the accountant, basic cash flow forecasting, catching mistakes before suppliers noticed them, chasing late receivables, rebuilding systems Dad hated because he thought systems were what people used when they didn't have real business instincts. He said things like that all the time. He loved instinct. Instinct was just a prettier word for improvising with other people's risk. The business started slipping slowly. Again. That matters. This wasn't a dramatic collapse all at once. It was erosion. First, a bad quarter. Then, a delayed payment from a commercial account. Then, one too many inventory bets that didn't move fast enough. Then, tax issues Dad had delayed because he thought he could smooth them out later. Then, lender pressure. I saw it before anyone else said it out loud. That's another curse of being the quiet one in the back. You see the real numbers long before the loud people run out of stories. At first, I tried to tell him gently. The phrasing matters in families like mine. You don't just say, "We're bleeding cash." You say, "I think we should slow new purchasing for a month." You say, "Maybe we should look at the receivables before expanding inventory again." You say, "I'm a little concerned about the tax timeline." Concerned. Little. Maybe. That was how I spoke to my father, when I still believed useful daughters got heard if they were polite enough. They don't. He brushed it off every time. Said I worried too much. Said local business was cyclical. Said the bank liked him. Said men had built companies long before spreadsheets decided to panic about them. That was Dad. Everything that made him uncomfortable became overthinking the second it came from me. By the time the accountant finally used the word critical, we were much deeper in than Daniel ever knew. And Daniel really didn't know. That's important too. He saw a business under pressure. Sure. But he still thought it was the kind of pressure you fix with hustle and optimism and maybe a new product push. He had no idea what the actual exposure looked like, because nobody had ever let him near the real numbers for long enough to understand them. Dad liked sons near the performance of business. He liked daughters inside the machinery. Very different thing. The worst period lasted about 8 months. 8 ugly months of vendor calls, bank meetings, delayed checks, payroll panic, and watching my father get angrier at reality for refusing to respect his confidence. Mom held her position through all of it. Publicly loyal, privately anxious, always translating him. He's under enormous pressure. He's not sleeping. You know how much of himself he's put into that place. Try not to correct him in front of people right now. That last one was my favorite. We were circling insolvency. And I was still expected to manage his dignity first. At some point, I stopped being his daughter in that company and became his shield. The problem was, shields eventually break if nobody notices they're taking the hit. The turning point came when the bank stopped treating the company like a local legacy and started treating it like a risk file. That was the first time my father could not charm his way around the numbers. The lender wanted structure, collateral, clean reporting, a credible operating plan, someone whose name meant lower risk. Not nostalgia. That someone was not my father anymore, and it definitely wasn't Daniel. It was me. I still remember that conversation in the kitchen at my parents' house. Dad pacing. Mom silent for once. Daniel pretending to understand enough to stay in the room. Me sitting there with a notebook full of options that all felt terrible. One path was slow death. Another was sale. Another was restructuring. The only path that kept the doors open involved new capital, personal exposure, and a formal ownership shift large enough to make the bank take the business seriously again. I didn't say yes immediately. That's something people forget later. They act like I stepped in because I was desperate to matter. I wasn't. I stepped in because by then too many other people's lives depended on the company surviving. Longtime staff. A warehouse manager who had been there since I was in middle school. 2 truck drivers with families. Vendors who had extended trust they probably shouldn't have. And yes, my parents too. I said yes because the collapse had finally become more expensive than the rescue. Not because anyone made me feel seen. The deal that followed was not symbolic. It was brutal. My savings went in. My credit got tied to the rescue structure. My reporting systems became mandatory instead of advisory. And the ownership documents changed. That part was not meant to be temporary. That part was not ceremonial. It was the price of keeping the business alive. The bank needed majority control where the discipline already was. That was me. Dad signed because he had to. Not because he respected what it meant. That distinction explains almost everything that happened later. On paper, the company changed. In the family story, it didn't. That was where the real problem started. Dad could live with me saving the business. He could not live with me being seen as the person who had saved it. Mom adjusted the story immediately. She got very good at describing me in ways that kept my labor visible but my authority invisible. Emily keeps everything organized. Emily is amazing with paperwork. Emily helps her father so much. Emily is more comfortable behind the scenes. That last one made me want to scream. More comfortable? No. More trained? There's a difference. You can train a girl to disappear inside competence for a long time if the whole family benefits from it. And Daniel? Daniel slid into a new version of the same old role. He still got treated like the future of the company even after the ownership changed. Because ownership on paper and inheritance in people's heads are not always the same thing. That was the family delusion. Dad remained the founder. Mom remained his witness. I remained the quiet one. Daniel remained the son. That hierarchy survived birthdays, vendor dinners, local chamber events, supplier lunches, and every holiday where someone would inevitably ask how the business was doing. Dad always answered. Even when the answer was mine. That's why the bank scene mattered so much. It wasn't just one humiliating introduction. It was the collapse of a carefully maintained illusion. My parents had spent 3 years acting like my ownership was technical and Dad's control was natural. Daniel had been allowed to believe he was still standing closest to the future. And I had gone along with too much of it because I thought keeping the peace bought stability. It doesn't. It buys delay. That was the backstory to the banker asking for the real owner. Not a sudden misunderstanding? A long family habit of letting me do the work. Carry the risk. Protect the structure. And then step politely aside so the right people could still feel like themselves in public. That's the thing about being the quiet one in the back. People forget you can still read the documents. I should probably tell you I stayed calm because I had some kind of plan. I didn't. What I had was training. Years of knowing exactly how not to move too fast in front of my father. Years of hearing my mother's voice in my head whenever a room got tense. Don't make it worse. Don't embarrass him. Don't force this into public. So when the banker pushed the signature page toward me and asked if I wanted him to walk through the revised terms, I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the paper. Then, at my father. Then at the banker again. And in that pause, everything changed. Not because anybody shouted. Because the room had stopped following my family's script. That was the problem. My parents came into that meeting thinking they were bringing the narrative with them. Dad as founder. Mom as witness. Me as useful support. Daniel, as the son, absorbing the future by standing close enough to it. Instead, the banker had followed the documents. And the documents had landed on me. That was the inciting moment. Not the introduction. Not even the question about the real owner. This. The second an outsider made my role legally unavoidable. My father smiled again. That was always a bad sign. His meanest moments almost never arrived with anger first. They came dressed as patience. Emily, he said. Still looking at the banker. not me. Signing authority and actual ownership are not always the same thing. That sentence was for the room. Not because it was true. Because it sounded plausible if nobody challenged it fast enough. The banker did not argue. He just said, "In this case, they appear to align." Appear. Again. That careful bank language? Not trying to humiliate my father. Not trying to rescue me. Just staying exactly where the documents put him. That made Dad look worse than hostility ever could have. My mother laughed softly again. "Emily gets so nervous in meetings," she said. "She's brilliant with details. But her father usually handles the big decisions." There it was. Another layer. Not only was I the quiet one, now I was also too nervous for strategy. Too useful for the back. Too fragile for the front. That was one of the oldest family lies about competent daughters. If they can't deny your work, they start denying your temperament. I looked at her. Then at Daniel. He was finally fully paying attention now. Which should tell you how strange the room had gotten. Usually Daniel only leaned in when money, conflict, or male ego entered the picture strongly enough to override his boredom. The banker turned the file one more time and said, "Miss Carter, before we continue, I need verbal confirmation from you that you're comfortable moving forward under the proposed structure." Verbal confirmation. Not Dad. Me. That's when my father made his first real mistake. He answered for me. "She's comfortable." The banker paused, looked at him, then at me, and said, "I'll need to hear that from her." That line hit my father harder than the ownership question had. I could see it in his jaw. Not because the banker was rude, because he wasn't. He was exact. And exact people are dangerous when your whole family runs on blurry language. My father leaned back and folded his hands, which meant he was trying to look relaxed again. "Emily," he said, voice lower now, "why don't you let me take this part? Let me take this part." That phrase could have meant a dozen things to a stranger. To me, it meant, get back in line. Give me the room. Don't make this public. Don't make me say it harder. That was when I realized I had a decision to make. A real one. Not about the financing. Not yet. About whether I was going to keep helping my family perform the same lie in front of people who now had access to paper. Because once you do that enough times, it changes you. You start anticipating everyone's comfort before your own reality. You start protecting the people who erase you, because you're used to being praised for being mature. Easy. Understanding. Quiet. That was my role in the family. Quiet. Useful. Back office. Never center. I know now that it was a trap dressed up as a personality. At the time, all I knew was that my heart was beating too fast, and the banker was waiting. So I said the smallest true thing I could. "I'd like to review the terms myself." Silence. Not huge silence. Not dramatic silence. But enough. Enough that the banker nodded and slid the packet fully toward me. Enough that my mother stopped smiling. Enough that Daniel actually sat up. And enough that my father looked at me in a way he had not looked at me in years. Not father to daughter. Owner to mutiny. I took the packet and started reading. Fast at first. Then slower. The terms themselves weren't the problem. In fact, they were better than I expected. The line of credit had been structured around current reporting strength, inventory stabilization, and operational controls I had put in place over the previous 2 years. The banker wasn't investing in my father's old instinct model. He was financing the version of the business I had rebuilt. That part mattered, because it meant the bank hadn't just noticed my ownership. It had noticed my management. That was probably the first time anyone in an important room had reflected the truth back at me without my father translating it first. Then I got to the expansion authorization page. And that was where the real inciting problem appeared. There was a handwritten note clipped to the back of the packet. Not from the bank. From my father. It was short. Barely 3 lines. Only sign after we discuss family structure. This does not change succession. Dad. I stared at it. For 1 second. The whole room faded out. Not literally. But that's how it felt. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Why he had still agreed to come to the bank with me. Why he hadn't blown up earlier. Why my mother kept trying to frame me as support. Why Daniel had been brought along at all. This wasn't just a meeting about financing. Dad had planned to let me do the legal work while still privately reserving the symbolic future for Daniel. That was the deal in his head. I could stabilize the company. I could sign the paperwork. I could keep the place alive. But I was not supposed to believe that meant I had the right to shape what came next. That still belonged to the son, even after the rescue, even after the ownership shift, even after the bank chose me as the credible party in the room. I looked up. Dad saw the note in my hand and knew immediately. His face changed. Just slightly. But enough. He said. Very calmly. That was for later. My mother jumped in at once. It's not what it looks like. That line would have worked better if she hadn't said it before, asking what I had actually found. Daniel frowned. What note? No one answered him. That was useful too. Because it told me he had not seen this part either. Dad had planned around all of us in different ways. He had given Daniel inheritance atmosphere. My mother, emotional management. And me, operational duty. But the real planning had stayed with him. I held up the note. What exactly does not change succession mean? The banker went very still. That mattered. You could tell he didn't want to become part of a family confrontation. But he also understood. Suddenly, that the financing conversation he thought he was having was sitting on top of something much uglier. Dad said, "This is not relevant to the bank." He was wrong. Because the second you tell one person they are the legal owner and privately tell your daughter not to mistake that for succession, you are no longer separating family and business. You are contaminating both. I looked at him and said, "You brought a note to your majority owner, telling her not to misunderstand her own authority." The banker looked at the note. Then at me. Then at my father. Mom said, "Emily, please." Again. Always please. Never stop him. Never this is wrong. Always please. I was so tired of that word. I said, "No. That was the real inciting incident. Not the paperwork. Not the title. Not even the banker's question. This. Saying no in a room where my family had always counted on me saying yes quietly enough for them to keep their dignity." Daniel looked at Dad and asked, "What succession?" That question cracked the whole room open. Because now the hidden structure had to either become public or collapse under the pressure of being half-named. Dad tried one last time to steer it. "We can discuss this at home. Home. Private. Later. In my family." Those words all meant the same thing. Once the witnesses are gone, the truth gets softer. And I get cornered back into being reasonable. I looked at the banker. Then at the note. Then at my father. And I understood something all at once. This meeting was never just about whether the business would expand. It was about whether my ownership was real or merely useful. Dad thought he could keep both versions alive. The legal one for banks. The family one for control. That note gave him away. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I set the financing packet down on the banker's desk and asked the question nobody in my family wanted answered in public. If I'm the majority owner when the business needs saving, why am I suddenly not the successor when it matters? Nobody answered my question right away. That was the first answer. Not a good one. Not a complete one. But in families like mine, silence is often the cleanest answer you get before the lying starts. I had asked a simple question. If I was the majority owner when the business needed saving, why was I suddenly not the successor when it mattered? That should have had a simple answer if their version of the story was real. It didn't. My father looked at the banker first. Not me. That told me everything. He was still trying to manage the room before he dealt with the truth inside it. "We're not discussing family succession here," he said. There it was again. That polished tone. That steady voice. The one he used whenever he wanted to make it sound like the problem was not what he had done, but where I had chosen to notice it. The banker didn't say anything. That was smart. He was no longer in a financing meeting. He knew that. We all did. He had become an unwilling witness to a family business lie breaking open in real time. And the best thing he could do was stay factual and still. My mother stepped in next. "Emily," she said softly, "your father means long-term continuity. That's all. That's all." I almost laughed. Because nothing poisonous in my family was ever introduced at full strength. It was always softened first. Reduced. Smoothed. Wrapped in language that made it sound practical. Inevitably. Even kind if you didn't look too closely. Long-term continuity. The son. The quiet one in the back. The one who helps. Different phrases. Same structure. I said, "Then say it clearly." My mother blinked. "What?" "Say it clearly." I kept my voice even. That mattered. If I sounded angry, they would make the anger the issue. If I cried, they'd call the whole thing emotional. If I over-explained, Dad would sit back and wait for the room to get tired of me. So I stayed clean. "You brought me to a bank where my legal authority matters," I said. Dad put a note in the file saying this doesn't change succession. Daniel clearly didn't know that. The banker didn't know that. So say it clearly. "What does succession mean?" Daniel looked from me to Dad. Then to Mom. Then back to the note. That was new too, for once. I wasn't the only one in the room realizing that a lot had been going on behind my back. Dad's jaw moved once. He said, "It means exactly what it sounds like." That was the second answer. And it was uglier. Because now he wasn't even trying to deny the structure. He was just trying to reassert control over how plainly it could be said. Daniel frowned. "You mean me?" Nobody answered him. That silence was worse than if they had. Because it didn't just confirm it. It confirmed they had all been living inside a story they assumed would never need to be said out loud in front of the person they were using. Me. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Daniel. "I think he means you," I said. Mom said my name immediately. Warning. Soft. Sharp underneath. "Emily." I ignored her. That was becoming a habit in the best possible way. Daniel stared at Dad now. "Why?" And there it was. The son finally asking the question that had been organizing half the room for years, without him ever needing to hear it directly. Dad answered too quickly. Because that was always the understanding. No. That was the lie at the center of all of it. Not that Daniel wanted the business. He probably did. In the vague way people want the glossy public part of things they've never had to carry. Not that my father wanted the company to stay under his preferred version of the family line. Of course he did. The lie was that there had ever been an understanding. There had only been an assumption. And assumptions are what powerful people call their preferences when they've never had to defend them. I said, No. It wasn't." Dad looked at me. "Don't do this." Another old phrase. "Don't do this." Which meant, don't say the quiet part in front of witnesses. Don't collapse the hierarchy in public. Don't make me sound like what I am. I said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm correcting you." That landed. Hard. Not because I raised my voice. Because I didn't. The banker shifted slightly in his chair. That was the only movement he'd made in almost a minute. He still wasn't speaking. Still wasn't rescuing anyone. But the room was no longer behaving like a family room. It was behaving like a place where facts were starting to matter more than deference. That was dangerous for my father. He said, "You were never meant to carry this business forever." I actually stared at him. Because that was the first truly honest thing he had said all day. Not useful. Not strategic. Honest. And it explained almost everything. Why my ownership was always described as temporary in tone, even when the documents were not. Why my mother framed me as support no matter how central I became. Why Daniel stayed positioned as some future symbol while I handled the actual present. Why my father could accept my sacrifice, but not my status. I was never meant to carry it forever. I was meant to save it, then step back. That's what daughters like me are for in families like mine. Emergency competence. Temporary stabilization. Quiet labor, until the right man is ready to stand in front of the thing again and call it his. I looked at him and said, "Then you should have let it die." Nobody moved. Not even Daniel. That line hurt all of us, including me. Because I knew exactly what it meant. It meant, if my work was good enough to rescue the company, my name was good enough to secure the financing, my systems were good enough to make the bank trust us again. But none of that was good enough to give me the future. Then what my father wanted was not help. He wanted extraction. And the moment I saw that cleanly, I stopped feeling confused. I started feeling angry. Not loud, angry. Past that. The kind that makes your vision sharpen. Mom whispered. "Don't say that." I looked at her. Why not? She had no answer. Because there wasn't one. The whole family setup had always depended on one thing, me doing the work without naming the exchange clearly enough to make it sound ugly. Dad founded it. I saved it. Daniel inherited the idea of it. Mom made it all sound like family. That arrangement only works if the daughter never says the trade out loud. I had just said it. The banker cleared his throat very lightly. That tiny sound reset the room just enough for reality to come back in. He said, carefully, "I think it may make sense for us to pause the financing discussion until ownership authority is fully aligned internally." There. That was the public cost. Not the final one. Just the first. Because for all my father's obsession with appearances, he had now succeeded in doing the one thing banks hate most, introducing uncertainty around control in the middle of a financing review. And the irony was brutal. He had spent years minimizing my ownership in public. Now that same public minimization was threatening the very deal he wanted. Dad's face changed when the banker said that. Not visibly enough for a stranger. Maybe. Enough for me. I had seen him furious my whole life. But there is a particular kind of fury that only shows up when reality embarrasses a man who thought he could manage it better than everyone else. That was what this was. He turned to the banker and said, "There is no uncertainty." The banker didn't flinch. "With respect," he said, "there appears to be disagreement in the room." That line almost made me laugh again. Because what he called disagreement was much worse than that. It was a father trying to preserve patriarchal succession after legally surrendering majority control to his daughter. But bankers do not need dramatic language. They only need enough uncertainty to stop trusting the structure in front of them. That was already there. Daniel said, "Wait. So if Emily owns most of it, then what exactly am I supposed to be taking over?" There it was. Not a noble question, but a useful one. And maybe the most honest question he had ever asked in that family. Dad said, "That is not the point." Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "That seems exactly like the point." That changed the room too. Because Daniel had now stepped out of the passive son position and into the role of potential loser. And once that happened, his loyalty to the old family narrative weakened fast. Mom could hear it. So could Dad. She tried to patch it. "We're all tired," she said. "This is turning into something it doesn't need to be." No. It was finally turning into what it had always been. That was the difference. I closed the folder in front of me and slid the note out again. Then I laid it flat beside the banker's packet. "This," I said, tapping Dad's handwriting, "is why we're here now. Not because I'm making a scene. Because he wanted my authority for the financing and Daniel for the future." I turned to the banker. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this." That mattered too. Because I meant it. And because it was the first fully adult sentence in the room that wasn't trying to manipulate anybody, the banker gave a small nod. Dad said my name again. Low. Tight. Enough. I looked at him. No. That was the breaking point. Not because it was loud. Because it was final. And I could feel everyone in the room understand that. For years. No. Had only ever meant delay. In my family. Soften her. Guilt her. Wait her out. Bring mom in. Reframe it. Make it sound cruel. Try again later. This no felt different. Because it had witnesses. Because it had paper. Because it had already cost something. The financing meeting was over. The story in the room was not. Dad stared at me and said, "You are willing to damage your whole family over pride." That sentence would have hooked into me once. Deeply. The good daughter reflex. The one that makes you immediately ask whether setting one boundary too clearly has made you selfish. I still felt the reflex. I just didn't obey it anymore. I said, "No. I'm refusing to disappear so you can keep lying about who built this version of the company." That was the line that finished the meeting. Not because anyone clapped. Not because the banker suddenly took my side in some dramatic way. Because nobody had anywhere left to go after that except the truth. And my family had already shown, in front of a bank, that they could not survive there comfortably. The banker closed the financing packet. Dad went very still. Mom looked like she wanted to cry but was too angry to manage it well. Daniel looked like someone who had just realized the family business story he'd been fed his whole life had a missing center. And me? I finally understood what the banker had accidentally done when he asked for the real owner. He had not just embarrassed my parents. He had forced the quiet one to answer from the front. For a second. Nobody moved after that. Not my father. Not my mother. Not Daniel. Not even the banker. That silence felt bigger than anything anyone had said, because I had finally named the thing my family had spent years dressing up in softer language. I wasn't just the quiet one in the back. I wasn't just the one who helped. I was the person who had actually held the business together while my father kept performing ownership and my brother kept absorbing inheritance without ever being told what it cost. And now all of that was sitting in a bank office under fluorescent light. With paperwork, that was the part my father could not survive comfortably. Not the truth itself. The documentation of it. He looked at me and said, very quietly, "You need to stop." Need. Not should. Not maybe. Need. That word took me right back to being 14 and getting told not to correct him in front of guests. 17 and being told to let Daniel talk because he needs confidence. 22 and being told not to mention a payroll mistake at dinner because your father doesn't need that tone in his own house. Need. It had always meant the same thing. Protect the structure. Protect the men. Protect the story. I didn't this time. I looked at the banker and said, "I'm sorry this has turned into something else. But I need it noted that I was presented with a handwritten instruction about succession inside the financing packet." That sentence changed the room. Not because it was loud. Because it was formal. Deliberate. It turned the whole moment from family shame into record. My father heard that immediately. His head snapped toward me. "You are not putting that into the meeting." I stared at him. "You already did." That landed hard. Because it was true. He was the one who had put the note in the packet. He was the one who had tried to use a financing meeting to quietly lock me into legal responsibility while privately reminding me that, in his mind, the future still belonged to the son. My mother stood up too fast and knocked the edge of her chair into the desk behind her. "Emily. Enough." There it was again. Always enough once the truth got expensive. Never enough when I was staying late at the warehouse fixing reporting problems. Never enough when I was sorting tax notices at midnight. Never enough when I was the one keeping lenders calm and suppliers paid. Only enough when I started speaking from the front. The banker looked at the note. Then at my father. Then at me. And to his credit, he did not try to rescue the atmosphere. He just asked, very evenly. Miss 4. Carter, are you comfortable moving forward with the financing under the current internal conditions? That was the real question. Not just whether I wanted the line of credit, whether I was willing to keep signing my name into a structure that still treated my ownership as temporary, conditional, and politically embarrassing. I looked at the packet. Then, the note. Then, my father. And I realized something all at once. If I signed in that room, under those conditions, after finding that note, I would be teaching all three of them the same lesson they had been living off for years. Emily will take the risk, do the work, save the thing, and swallow the insult if the timing is bad enough. No, not anymore. I put the pen down. I'm not signing today, I said. That was the climax. Not the banker's question. Not the note. That sentence. Because until then, everyone in the room had still been operating under one quiet assumption that whatever happened emotionally, I would still do the responsible thing in the end. And, in my family, the responsible thing almost always meant the thing that protected everybody else first. My father went cold. Completely cold. You are making a serious mistake. Maybe. But it was the first serious mistake that was going to be mine. Not inherited. Not assigned. Not cleaned up after someone else. Mine. I said, no. I'm refusing to sign while you're still trying to strip the authority out of what you already asked me to carry. Daniel looked at me like I had slapped him. Not because of the financing. Because I had used the word authority. Out loud. In front of Dad. In front of the banker. That word didn't belong to me in our family story. Competence. Yes. Dependability. Yes. Usefulness. Absolutely. But authority? No. That had always been saved for men. Even when women were doing the work underneath it. Dad took one step toward the desk. The banker sat straighter. That detail matters. He didn't look scared. He looked alert. Which is what people in institutions do when family emotion starts interfering with paper. My father said. This expansion has been in motion for months. I said. Then you should have thought about that before slipping succession instructions into my packet. My mother actually flinched. I think that was the first moment she fully understood there was no way to soften this into a misunderstanding later. Not with the banker there. Not with the note in the packet. Not with me refusing to cover it by signing anyway. She tried one last time. Emily. Your father is under a lot of pressure. That line would have worked once. It really would have. Because I had been trained from childhood to hear male pressure as a reason for female accommodation. If Dad was stressed, I should be gentler. If Daniel was insecure, I should be quieter. If the business was in trouble, I should be stronger. If the room got tense, I should get smaller. That had been the whole system. I was done with it. I looked at her and said, so was I. The difference is nobody ever built a family mythology around that. Silence again. The banker closed the financing file. Not abruptly. Just carefully. And that sound paper closing. Decision pausing did more to my father than anything I could have said. Because now the cost had become concrete. Not emotional. Not symbolic. Operational. A paused deal. A bank noticing instability. A daughter refusing to carry risk under insult. Dad said. Daniel. Say something. That surprised all of us. Even Daniel. Because it was naked in a way Dad usually avoided. He had reached for the sun. Reached for the future. Reached for reinforcement in the moment he felt public control slipping. Daniel looked at him. Then at me. Then at the packet. And what happened next was not noble. But it was honest. Did you ever plan to tell me she actually owned most of it? He asked. Not. Were you wrong? Not. Why did you do this to her? Not. Is this fair? Just. What did you keep from me? That's Daniel. Still. It helped. because it proved the hierarchy had cracked from more than one side now. Dad didn't answer. Mom said, "That's not what matters right now." Daniel laughed once. A short, ugly laugh. "It kind of seems like it is." That shifted the room again. Not toward me exactly. Away from Dad. And sometimes, that's enough. I picked up the note and folded it once. Then I slipped it back into the packet and slid the whole thing toward the banker. "Can I get a copy of everything we reviewed today before any next meeting is scheduled?" I asked. My father said my name again. Sharp this time. No softness left. "Emily." That was the breaking point he had been avoiding all afternoon. The moment where he stopped pretending this was about the company and started sounding exactly like what he was, a man losing control of a story he had relied on for years. I looked him right in the face and said, "You should have let the quiet one stay in the back if that's where you wanted me." That line hung in the room. Not because it was theatrical. Because it was true. He needed me visible enough to save the company, and invisible enough not to threaten the myth of him owning it. That balancing act had finally failed. The banker said, "We can provide copies." "Yes. And I think it would be best if we paused here." Paused here. Another exact sentence. No drama. No side-taking. Just institutional language, doing what institutions do when families drag fantasy into finance. Dad looked at the banker like he had personally betrayed him. Then he looked at me like I had done something worse. "You are willing to hurt everyone over this," he said. There it was. The final family accusation. Not, "You're wrong." Not, "You misunderstood." Not, "The papers say something else." Just the oldest weapon left. "You are hurting the family." That sentence is powerful when you've spent your whole life trying not to be the one who does harm. And yes, part of me still felt it. That's the honest part. Part of me still wanted to fold, to apologize for the atmosphere, to sign and fix it later, to get everybody out of the room first and deal with my own rage afterward. But then I looked at the packet, at the note, at my own hands, at the banker who had asked the clean question nobody in my family had wanted asked out loud. And I knew this. Signing would not keep the family safe. It would keep the lie safe. So I said, "No, I'm just not saving it this way anymore." That was the line that ended the meeting. Not because anyone agreed. Because nobody had anywhere honest left to go after it. The financing was paused. The packet stayed closed. My father stood there with no public authority that could override the documents. My mother had run out of soft language. Daniel looked like he had just realized the family business had two versions, the one Dad told in public, and the one paper told when nobody could interrupt it. And me? For the first time in that office, I did not feel like the quiet one at all. I felt like the person the bank had asked for from the beginning. The strangest part was that nobody argued with the banker once the meeting was paused. Not really. My father tried. Of course he did. He said things like, "This is being taken out of context." And "We're dealing with an internal misunderstanding." And "The financing shouldn't be affected by a family disagreement," but the force had gone out of it. The room had already shifted. Because once a bank closes the file in front of you, the story changes. Up until then, my parents had still been trying to manage the scene. After that, they were reacting to consequences. That is not the same thing. The banker stood, gathered the packet, and said he'd have copies of everything sent over before end of day. He also said any next meeting would need clarified authority and internal alignment before the bank moved forward. Internal alignment. Another polite phrase. But coming from him, it meant something very different than when my mother used phrases like that. When she said family words, they were meant to blur reality. When he said them, they were meant to stop a deal until reality matched the file. I thanked him. That mattered too. Not because I was trying to be gracious, because I wanted one thing in that room to stay clean. He had done his job. He had followed the documents. He had not joined the family performance just because my father brought enough confidence into the room to make some people flinch. My father hated that kind of person. People who are polite and exact are dangerous to men who survive on narrative. We walked out of the office in silence. The branch felt too bright. Too open. That strange public quiet you get after something humiliating happens in a place where everyone else politely pretends not to notice. My mother walked 2 steps ahead. Like maybe distance alone could make it less obvious we had all come in together. My father had his jaw set so tightly it looked painful. Daniel kept glancing at me. Then away. Then back again. He wanted to ask questions. He also wanted not to be the son who asked them in front of Dad. That tug of war was all over his face. Outside. The parking lot was hot enough that the air above the asphalt looked distorted. My father didn't even wait until we reached the cars. He turned to me and said, "You made a spectacle of this." There it was. The first move after consequence. Not, "I shouldn't have put the note in the packet." Not, "I shouldn't have let the bank discover this that way." Not, "I shouldn't have spent years pretending your ownership was cosmetic." No. You made a spectacle of this. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so predictable, it felt lazy. I said, "You put succession instructions into a financing packet." My mother stepped in instantly. "We are standing in a parking lot," she said. Low and sharp. "This is not the place." That line would have worked on me once. Maybe not because I agreed. Because I had spent so many years trying not to be the woman people watched in public. That had been part of the training too. Don't make scenes. Don't raise your voice. Don't force private ugliness into public view. Protect the family from witnesses. Even if the family never protects you from the thing itself. Not anymore, I said. The bank was not the place either. But that didn't stop you. That shut her up for half a second. Then Daniel finally asked it. "So what actually happened 3 years ago?" Good. That was the right question. And he asked it looking at Dad. Not me. Better. Because one of the reasons families like mine survive so long is that the daughter in the back gets trapped doing all the explaining. The men act. The mother interprets. And the daughter gets assigned the exhausting task of turning a lifetime of patterns into something gentle enough for everyone else to hear. I was done with that. I looked at Dad and said, "You should answer him." He didn't. He looked at me. Then at Daniel. Then back at me. That was answer enough. Daniel laughed once. Short. Uncomfortable. "No. Seriously." "What happened?" Mom tried next. "The company was under pressure," she said. "Emily helped us stabilize things." Helped us. That phrasing almost made me tired enough to sit down on the curb. Helped us. That was how she did it. Everything I had done became help. Never leverage. Never authority. Never rescue. Just help. Temporary. Supportive. And somehow, emotionally softer than the truth. I said. The company was almost insolvent. Dad couldn't get the bank comfortable with the structure. I put in my savings. Took on the risk. And the ownership changed. Daniel looked at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. The ownership changed how? I pulled my keys out of my bag and unlocked my car. Not because I wanted to leave yet, but because I wanted something practical to do with my hands. Majority ownership, I said. To me. Silence. Then Daniel looked at Dad again. And this time, what showed on his face wasn't just confusion. It was insult. That mattered. Because Daniel had been living off a family myth too. Not the same myth my father had. Not the same one my mother carried. But still a myth. That he was moving naturally toward the future of the business. That his place in the family line had meaning beyond symbolism. That the business was still, in some vague, inevitable sense, Dad's to sons, and now, in one parking lot. With one paused bank deal, and one very inconvenient note. He had found out that not only was that not true, it had not been true for years. That was the reversal. Not revenge. Not triumph. Exposure. And exposure changes the map of a family, Dad said. The arrangement was made under pressure. There it was again. Arrangement. Pressure. As if the whole thing had been some temporary distortion rather than a legal restructuring he had signed because the alternative was collapse. I said, "You signed it." I had no choice. That one landed harder than he meant it to. Because now he had said it plainly in front of Daniel. Not that the structure was unfair. Not that the bank misunderstood. Not that the note had been taken the wrong way. Just, I had no choice. Which meant, she had the leverage. She kept us open. And I've hated the paper ever since. Daniel heard it. Mom heard it too. She stepped in and said, "This doesn't mean your father didn't build the company." I turned to her. No one said he didn't. That was the exhausting part. Families like mine always try to make truth sound like erasure the second it stops flattering the men at the center. My father built the company. Yes. He also nearly lost it. Also yes. I helped save it. Not helped with paperwork. Helped save it. And the ownership documents reflected that because banks are not in the business of preserving male self-image. Daniel leaned against his car and rubbed a hand over his face. So the bank has been treating Emily like the owner this whole time, I said. Yes, Dad said. At the same time. That's not the full picture. I looked at him. The full picture was in the packet. You're the one who added the note. That got him. Really got him, because the note was the one thing he could not explain away cleanly. The letter of the law was already against him. The bank had already followed the documents. The family introduction had already failed. But the note? The note showed intention. Not confusion. Not sloppiness. Intention. He took one step toward me. Not enough to frighten me. Enough to try to re-establish pressure. You could have handled this privately. There it was again. Private? That word had carried so much theft in my life. Private usually meant, let us corner you without witnesses. Let Dad control the temperature. Let Mom call it concern. Let Daniel stay comfortable. And let me leave still looking like the one who keeps everything running and asks for nothing in return. No, I said. You had 3 years to handle it honestly. That line did something to him. Not outwardly. My father didn't do outwardly unless he was with people beneath him, but something in his face changed. A fraction. A drop in the eyes. Enough that I knew I had finally hit the thing underneath all the tone and authority. Shame. Not much. Just enough. Because he knew I was right. He had not spent 3 years trying to integrate the new structure. He had spent 3 years trying to live as though the structure only counted in rooms where money demanded it. Everywhere else. He still wanted the story. Founder, father, future son, quiet daughter in the back, and now that story had broken in front of the bank. In front of Daniel. And in front of me. Mom tried one final appeal. Do you really want to damage the business over this? That question almost would have worked if I had not been carrying the business emotionally and operationally for years already. Damage the business. Not. Protect yourself. Not. Clarify authority. Not. Stop signing into disrespect. Damage the business. As if my silence had always been the stabilizer. As if their dishonesty had been neutral until I reacted to it. I said, no. I want a business I don't have to disappear inside. That was the sentence that changed everything. Because even Daniel looked at me differently after that. Not admiringly. Just actually looking. And maybe that's all justice is sometimes in families like mine. Not applause. Not apology. Not a perfect moral turnaround. Just the end of being misseen in your own presence. My phone buzzed then. An email. From the bank. Copies of the packet. The draft terms. The signature pages. The ownership confirmation summary. And the scanned note. I opened it right there. Dad saw the screen and said, "Don't forward that." Reflex. Immediate. That told me exactly what mattered most to him. Not the financing. Not the company. The record. Because once something exists in a bank scan, it becomes harder to call it emotional later. I said, "I'm sending it to my attorney." Mom looked genuinely alarmed for the first time all afternoon. Emily. No. That was easier now. Cleaner. I'm not doing another 3 years of this. That line ended the parking lot conversation. Not dramatically. Nobody stormed off. Nobody cried. Nobody made a public scene like they would later hint I had almost done. Dad got into his car without slamming the door, which somehow felt angrier than if he had. Mom stood there for a second like she wanted one last chance to reshape the whole thing into a sad family misunderstanding. Daniel looked between all of us like he had just found out the business he thought he was slowly inheriting had really belonged, on paper and in practice, to the sister he had never been taught to see clearly. Then they all left, one by one. I sat in my car for a full minute before turning the key. Not because I was falling apart, because I could finally feel the adrenaline leaving. My hands were shaking. My jaw hurt. And underneath the anger was something I had not expected. Relief. Thin. Sharp. Real. Because for the first time, the quiet one in the back had made the record front-facing. And the record had held. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in the parking lot with the engine off and the air inside, the car turning stale around me. And for the first time all afternoon, nobody was asking anything from me. No one needed me calm. No one needed me useful. No one needed me to make the ugly thing sound smaller so the family could still live with itself. That silence felt strange. Good, strange. I looked at my phone again. The bank email was still there. The scanned packet. The draft terms. The ownership summary. My father's note sitting in black and white, where it belonged now, not tucked into a folder. Not softened by Mom's voice. Not carried by my body like some private humiliation I was supposed to absorb for the sake of peace. A record. That mattered more than anything. Not because records are emotional. Because they aren't. And when you come from a family that survives by turning everything into mood, memory, and that's not what anyone meant. A record feels almost holy. I forwarded everything to my attorney before I even pulled out of the lot. Then I sent one more email. To myself. Subject line, bank meeting timeline. I wrote it while it was fresh. The introduction. The ownership question. The note. The succession language. My refusal to sign. The bank pausing the financing. The conversation in the parking lot. Short. Clean. Dated. No speeches. No adjectives I couldn't defend. That was another thing I had learned the hard way. Once the truth finally breaks open in a family like mine, you write it down before somebody tries to make it sound softer than it was. When I got home, the house felt almost too quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a second with my keys in my hand, still half expecting my phone to light up with some version of the same old pattern. Mom first. Maybe. Soft voice. Sad tone. Let's not make this bigger than it is. Then Dad. Colder. Shorter. Telling me I had no idea what I'd just risked. Then Daniel. Maybe hours later. Not because he cared most, but because confusion always moved through him, slower than entitlement. I was right. My mother texted first. Please don't do anything drastic until we've all calmed down. That was so exactly her I almost smiled. Not, I'm sorry we introduced you that way. Not, your father should never have brought that note. Not, you were right. Just don't do anything drastic. As if I were the active danger. As if the decades of minimization and the handwritten succession warning in a financing packet were all somehow prelude. And my reaction was the event itself. I didn't answer. That was new too. For years. I had answered quickly because silence felt cruel to me. That's another thing daughters like me get taught. That boundaries are aggression if they inconvenience the family emotionally. I was done with that. My father emailed about an hour later. Not texted. Emailed. Of course. He only became formal when he wanted distance to sound like authority. The message was short. He said the bank meeting had been regrettably derailed by emotional misinterpretation. That financing delays would now affect everyone who depends on the company. And that I should reconsider my decision once I was able to distinguish ownership pride from business responsibility. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my attorney too. Not because it was a legal bombshell. Because it was proof of pattern. Even now, after the bank had followed the documents, and after the note had exposed his real position, my father still needed the story to be that. I had confused my feelings with the business. That was his real talent. He could use you. Rely on you. Stand on what you built. And still call your claim to it emotional the second you asked for it to be publicly real. Daniel called later that night. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. Mostly because I wanted to hear, in his own words, how much of this had actually been hidden from him. He didn't say hello right away. He just said, "Did you really save the company?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Dad shouldn't have done that." Not, "I can't believe they introduced you like that." Just that. "Did you really save the company?" I sat down at my kitchen table before I answered. "Yes," I said. "I did." Silence. Then he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I could have said a lot there. Because they didn't want you to know. Because sons are easier to raise on mythology than daughters are. Because Dad needed you to believe the future still bent naturally toward you. Because Mom thought keeping you comfortable was the same thing as keeping the family together. All of that would have been true. What I said was, because the truth didn't fit the story. He didn't answer for a few seconds. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I thought you just handled paperwork." That one hurt. Not because it surprised me. Because it didn't. That was exactly the role my family had built for me, and sold so successfully that even the person supposedly being positioned against me had swallowed it whole. Paperwork. Not restructuring. Not financial rescue. Not operational control. Not risk. Paperwork. I laughed once. Softly. "Yeah," I said. That was the story. He asked me if the financing was dead. I told him probably not. But it was paused. And it would stay paused until the bank believed the authority structure in the room matched the authority structure on paper. That was the part that finally seemed to reach him. "So Dad can't just talk around it?" "No," I said. And for the first time in that entire conversation, I heard something close to respect in his voice. Not love. Not apology. Not even fairness. Just a sudden, uneasy understanding that the thing he had been standing next to his whole life was not actually his by right. And never had been. We hung up awkwardly. I didn't expect more from him that night. Honestly, I still don't know exactly how much to expect from him at all. That's one of the less satisfying truths in stories like this. Not every person who benefits from the family lie becomes redeemed when the lie breaks. Some people just become disoriented. Then they decide what matters most to them from there. The next morning, my attorney called. She had already reviewed the bank scan, the note, the ownership documents, and my follow-up summary. Her voice was steady in the way good professionals are steady when something emotional is also strategically clear. She said two things that mattered. First, I had done the right thing by not signing under those conditions. Second, the bank pause was inconvenient, but not catastrophic. That word helped. Inconvenient. Not ruinous. Not reckless. Not emotional sabotage. Inconvenient. And more importantly, appropriate. She also told me something else. The note could matter more than my father realized, because it showed a disconnect between the ownership structure presented for financing and the internal succession expectations he was still trying to preserve. If he wanted to keep treating me as a placeholder in practice while relying on me as controlling owner in legal and financial settings, that contradiction was now on paper. That contradiction. That was the whole story in 2 words. I spent the rest of that morning doing something I should have done much sooner. I started separating my life from my family's assumptions. I changed passwords. Not out of panic. Out of clarity. Bank folders. Shared accounting access. Vendor login credentials. Internal reporting dashboards. Anything that existed in that foggy zone between Emily handles it and Dad assumes he can reach it whenever he wants. That zone was over. Then I drafted a short memo to the bank. Professional. Simple. All future financing conversations would go through me directly. And any discussion of ownership, governance, or authorization should be documented in writing. I copied my attorney. Then, I sent a separate internal email to the company accountant requesting a full updated cap table and ownership authority summary for the corporate records. That felt better than I can explain. Not because it was aggressive, because it was adult. A whole different thing. For years, I had used my competence to keep a bad family structure running smoothly. Now, for once, I was using it to protect myself from it. My mother showed up at my house that evening. Of course she did. She knocked softly. The way people knock when they want the gesture itself to count as respect, even after they've spent years walking right through your emotional boundaries. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. That was new too. She noticed. Mara. Then she stopped herself. Wrong story. She blinked. Corrected. And said, Emily. I just looked at her. She was dressed too carefully for a spontaneous visit. Light makeup. Nice blouse. That meant this was not just maternal concern. This was narrative repair. She had come to put shape back on something that had gone public in a way she hated. She said, Your father feels blindsided. I almost smiled. Blindsided. That word. After the introduction. The note. The years of public erasure. He felt blindsided. I said, That's interesting. She sighed the way she always did when I wasn't helping her build the softer version fast enough. Emily? You know how he is. There it was. The oldest sentence in our family. You know how he is. Which always meant, adjust yourself to the man. Make room for his blind spots. Translate his damage into burden. Then call it love. I said, Yes. I do. She waited, probably expecting the rest of the old script. He's under pressure. I know. I'll give it time. We can talk later. I didn't mean for it to go that way. Instead, I said, That's the problem. She stared at me for a second, and in that moment, I think she really understood that the old mechanism was gone. Not weakened. Gone. I was not going to volunteer again for the role of carrying everybody else's emotional water while they stood on my work and called me helpful. She said, quietly, You could destroy this business if you pushed too hard. That was the final family threat. Never direct enough to quote easily later. Just enough to place responsibility for the whole structure back on me. I said, No, I'm the reason it's still standing. That was the closest thing to a victory line I ever got. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the one sentence my family had spent years trying to keep out of public air. She left not long after that. No apology. No breakthrough. No beautiful reconciliation. That's another thing people get wrong about endings. They think justice always arrives with confession. It doesn't. Sometimes it arrives as accurate silence. Sometimes it arrives as a paused bank file, and a scanned note, and a daughter no longer willing to call invisibility maturity. The financing eventually moved forward. Not right away. The bank required updated governance confirmations and a revised meeting with authority lines explicitly documented. My father hated every second of that. The accountant was looped in. The lawyer was looped in. The bank dealt with me directly. There was no dramatic showdown after that. because there didn't need to be one. Paper did the work. That was the justice. Not humiliation for its own sake. Not revenge fantasy. Correction. The room at the bank had introduced my parents to something they had never really respected before, a version of the truth that did not care what role they preferred me to play. Daniel changed after that. Not all at once, and not enough to make a sentimental story out of. But something shifted. He stopped making little jokes about me being the spreadsheet person. He started asking actual questions in meetings. Real ones. Sometimes stupid ones. But real. Once, a few months later, I heard him correct a sales rep who called Dad the owner. He said, awkwardly, technically, Emily runs this now. Technically, not exactly poetry. Still, I took it. My father never apologized. I never expected him to. Men like him usually don't apologize when truth humiliates them. They just stop getting the version of you that once made the lie comfortable. That was enough for me. More than enough. Because the real ending wasn't the bank call. Or the pause deal. Or the note being caught. It was this. I stopped helping in the back. Not by quitting. Not by disappearing. By refusing to disappear inside the role they had written for me. The company stayed open. The financing moved. The records got cleaner, and for the first time in my life, when someone asked who actually owned what I had built, I didn't look at my father first. I answered for myself. That was the ending.